Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of The Page Turners. I'm your host Alex Huang, and today we'll be doing an exit interview on a grade 12 English student. Who do we have here? This is Matthew Tang. Pleasure to meet you, Matthew. Now I'm just going to be asking you a series of 5 questions. The first one being, which of the 3 perspectives explored in class, feminism, Marxism, or existentialism, resonated the most with you? I resonated the most with existentialism, a philosophy that states that each person is responsible for determining their fate and meaning through free will. And a key concept to this is the story of Sisyphus. He's cursed by the gods to push a boulder up a hill endlessly, yet he finds freedom in rebellion and embracing the struggle, not escaping it. Now this reminds me of a video game I played, Nier Automata, a game about androids fighting machines for humanity. As I guided characters like 2B or 9S through repeated cycles of conflict after later learning humanity was already extinct, the struggle lost any objective purpose. However, like Sisyphus endlessly pushing his boulder, continuing became a conscious choice of meaningful rebellion and freedom. In our course, this was exemplified by Layla from 10 minutes and 38 seconds in this strange world. Her life is filled with constant suffering through prostitution and abuse, yet she continues to rebel by forming loving and meaningful relationships with her 5 friends and DLE. Now, both characters achieve freedom by acknowledging their fate and finding joy in their conscious and sustained effort, hence the saying, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. And this really stuck with me because existentialism addresses life's greatest philosophical question of what's the meaning of life. I remember playing Nier Automata on its release as well, and it was definitely $60 well spent. Anyways, the next question I have for you is discuss a specific scene, theme, or idea from your RP novel that stood out most to you, and explain why it was challenging to make your response. A specific scene from The Emperor of Gladness by Ocean Vuong that really stood out to me is the ending, where Hyde was left in the dumpster and the reader doesn't know what he does next. Now, I found this particularly challenging because its open-endedness left me unsatisfied, and I thought a proper resolution meant a character's problems get tied up neatly. In Hyde's case, I rooted for him to escape the working class or reunite with his mom, especially after seeing his character development, which included a transition from addiction and attempted suicide to new and prosperous relationships with Grazina, Sony, and his coworkers. But after reflecting on the book, I realized Wong deliberately does this. Hai's messy resolution reflects the grueling reality of poverty, addiction, and the idea of the working class, which in reality does not always achieve the American dream. And the ending does a really good job of supporting the book's message, which challenges the idea of what a quote-unquote good life is. Does it always require conventional and huge accomplishments, or can meaning be found through small and thoughtful acts, like helping Sony and Alkim with their bail and their house, despite being buried in the midst of human trash? And I think this is the realism that Vuong was trying to portray, and although I struggled to see it at first, the ending captured it extremely well. I like the insight that you brought up in that response because I actually never saw it that way. Anyways, the next question I have for you is describe the aspect of McLuhan's laws that was the most interesting to you. In my view, the reversal tetrad is the most insightful. It highlights how technology can produce effects opposite to its intended purpose when taken to extremes, which is an especially important idea in a society driven by mass marketing and consumerism, where those downsides are rarely ever acknowledged. Take Apple, for example. They're going to be selling their iPhones by using the enhancement, the retrieval, and the obsolescence tetrads. How, for example, iPhones enhance portability and accessibility, or how iPhones retrieve ancient tendencies like communication or entertainment, right? Or finally, how this iPhone's camera, for example, makes older generations and other companies obsolete. But what they won't tell you is how their technology can actually be dangerous. How, for example, an over-reliance on a phone can actually weaken social skills or take time away from doing what's actually important, like spending time with family. And so the reversal tetrad ultimately provides the most compelling insight because it warns us of how technology can backfire and shape our behavior negatively, things that nobody explicitly tells us. Now, it's actually funny that you brought up an over-reliance on a phone as a reversal because, as you can see, my screen time is going upwards of 6 hours a day. Anyways, the next question I have for you is discuss the scene in King Lear that was the most impactful and explain. In my opinion, the reunion between King Lear and Cordelia in Act 4, Scene 7 is the most impactful scene in the play because of how it makes the reader feel and how it contrasts the rest of the play's madness. Throughout the tragedy, madness is closely tied to Goneril and Regan's cruelty and Lear's earlier ignorance. However, this scene marks a turning point where madness begins to give way to reason. Lear is humbled by constant suffering and finally gains clarity and self-awareness, admitting that, quote-unquote, I am a very foolish, fond old man. This moment reveals his recognition of his own mistakes, specifically the unjust banishment of Cordelia, and it also shows how the loss of power has restored his moral vision. Emotionally, the scene is deeply moving because of Cordelia's unconditional forgiveness. Despite being wronged, she responds with compassion rather than resentment, creating a rare moment of warmth. And this tenderness heavily contrasts scenes such as Gloucester's eyes being gouged out or Lear's abandonment into the storm, momentarily raising the audience's hope that redemption is possible. And this hope intensifies the tragedy as it makes the ending even more devastating, as Cordelia and Lear are both killed. Thank you, Matthew. Now the final question I have for you today is, what aspect of 10 minutes and 38 seconds in this strange world did you find most interesting or surprising, and also explain? The thing I found most interesting about this book is how Elif Shafak was able to contrast the cemetery of the companionless with Layla's 5 friends to illustrate the theme of erasure versus remembrance in a way that was super emotionally captivating. Now, throughout Layla's life and death, society repeatedly treats her as less than human, first by reducing her to the label of a prostitute, and later by stripping her of dignity entirely in the cemetery of the companionless, where outcasts are buried as numbers rather than mourned as people. This institutional erasure allows Layla's suffering to be ignored and her existence to be quietly discarded. In contrast, however, Layla's friends refuse to let her disappear. Through their loyalty, shared memories, and willingness to risk punishment to retrieve and honor her body, they actively preserve her humanity. Sinan's actions in particular prioritizes compassion over legality, sacrificing his reputation, his marriage, and his job for Layla's send-off into the ocean. And this contrast made this book deeply humane and kept me very invested throughout the experience. Now this marks the end of our interview. Thank you so much for your time and your answers, Matthew, and we'll see you guys in the next episode of The Page Turner.